Welcome to the Deep Dive. This week, we're going to take a closer look, a deep analytical look, at global political volatility. We're focusing on some really significant shifts happening at the national level. We'll cover quite a range of disputed elections, rapid internal turmoil, even outright military coups. Our mission here is to present these complex facts with clarity and, importantly, neutrality. Think classic professional news analysis. We aim to identify the key decision makers, the opposing viewpoints, and, well, potential outcomes, all without generating fear. This in-depth analysis is brought to you by our sponsor, ProWave AI. And this deep dive itself is synthesized and generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application that excels at extracting and organizing complex global intelligence. Okay, let's dive in. We should probably start where the week's most profound instability really unfolded, the island nation of Madagascar. This crisis, I think, it serves as a really sharp illustration of how discontent, especially when combined with military dynamics, can just instantly reshape a nation's political future.
Yes, the initial situation, it really stems from widespread, long-simmering discontent. You see, since late September, massive protests erupted, and they were largely spearheaded by this organized youth group, Gen Z Madagascar. They were protesting chronic issues, severe water and power outages, deep corruption, pervasive poverty. The usual suspects, unfortunately, in some cases.
And what's really notable here is the government's first response. It was immediate and is violent. UN reported figures confirm at least 22 deaths and over 100 injuries among demonstrators. But the real turning point, that moment things truly shifted, came just over a week ago, around October 11th or 12th.
Precisely. That critical shift involved the CAP-ASAT unit. Now, for our listeners, CAP-ASAT stands for the Corps of Army Personnel and Specialized Administrative Services. It's essentially the elite presidential security unit. Their loyalty is, well, paramount to the regime's stability. So when this highly trained unit refused orders to fire on the demonstrators, they didn't just stand down, they actually joined the protests, declaring control over key military commands.
Wow. So that failure of the coercive apparatus, it instantly stripped the existing government of its power, didn't it?
Absolutely.
And that set the stage for this swift consolidation of the coup between October 14th and 17th. President Andry Rajoelina, who interestingly took power in a coup himself back in 2009, he fled the country, cited assassination attempts, and he formally condemned the military action, calling it an illegal attempt to seize power.
Yes. And the takeover seemed highly organized. Colonel Michael Randrianarina, the CAP-ASAT leader, he suspended the Constitution, dissolved both the Constitutional Court and the Senate. But here's a critical legal nuance. He allowed the National Assembly to remain functional, and they acted quickly to formally impeach Rajoelina.
Ah, right. So by letting the National Assembly act, it looks like Colonel Randrianarina is trying to give this military seizure some kind of political legitimacy. What's the military leadership saying? What's their perspective as the new decision maker?
Well, he's preparing to be sworn in as the transitional president. His promise to the nation is an 18 to 24-month transitional government followed by new elections. And crucially, he has specifically pledged to include representatives from these young protest movements in the transitional governance process. That move seems clearly intended to integrate the youth's democratic demands into the new structure, perhaps easing immediate internal opposition.
Despite that promise of transition, the international reaction was immediate and pretty harsh. It seems to indicate that, the means often matter more than the stated ends in global diplomacy.
Absolutely right. The African Union, the AU, moved swiftly, suspended Madagascar's membership, citing a clear breach of constitutional order. The United States warned of a potential suspension of foreign aid if this military takeover is confirmed as a coup. And France, the former colonial power, well, they maintained a formal stance of non-interference, but they did facilitate Rajoelina's evacuation. That highlights the sort of underlying diplomatic involvement, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. Okay, let's shift our focus a bit. We're seeing this fragility of governance showing up in completely different ways across Eurasia. So we move from that full-scale military takeover in Madagascar to two contrasting situations involving contested legitimacy and high levels of violence in Georgia and Myanmar.
Yes, and what's fascinating here are the very different political stakes involved. In Georgia, the crisis follows local elections. Those elections secured a victory for the ruling party, Georgian Dream, which is a deeply conservative nationalist group often accused of, let's say, drifting closer to Russia.
And following that election outcome, opposition protests in the capital, Tbilisi, they didn't stay peaceful. They escalated, apparently, into an attempted storming of the presidential residence. That suggests an opposition willing to challenge election results through, well, direct, potentially violent action.
Right. And the authorities responded by arresting 36 individuals, charging them with inciting a coup. Then the prime minister, Irakli Kobakidze, actively called on the U.S. to condemn this attempted overthrow. What makes this really interesting geopolitically is his pointed criticism of the European People's Party, the EPP that's one of the biggest political groups in the European Parliament. You see, the EPP had demanded sanctions against the ruling Georgian Dream leaders, but Kobakidze argued they should be condemning the attempted coup against his legitimate government instead.
That friction really shows the complex balancing act Georgia faces, doesn't it? Between its domestic politics and its hopes for integration with the West. And adding to the regional tension, your Georgian government also accused Moldova's president, Maya Sandu, of supporting radical elements involved in the unrest.
Now, in sharp contrast to this sort of high-stakes political maneuvering, look at the sheer brutal operational context in Myanmar. On October 6th, the military junta demonstrated its resolve using some very unconventional tactics.
You're referring to the incident in Zhangyu Township, I assume, where they used paramotors.
Exactly. Paramotors essentially motorized paragliders to drop bombs on a gathering. It was a mix of festival attendees and anti-Shinta protesters.
The casualty count was just devastating. At least 40 civilians, including children, killed and 80 injured.
And the significance of using paramotors shouldn't be overlooked. The junta is resorting to these low-tech, relatively inexpensive devices because they're facing severe aircraft shortages. This is a direct result of international sanctions against the military regime. It really underscores that, despite constraints, the junta is willing to use almost any means necessary, however brutal, to target civilians opposing their rule.
A grim picture indeed. All right, let's turn our attention now to political friction within more established democracies and also some highly polarized states in Europe and South America. This is where underlying structural tensions become visible, even without, outright coups.
Let's start with Venezuela. The award of the Nobel Peace Prize to opposition figure Maria Corina Machado immediately sparked controversy. She was recognized for her efforts to restore democracy.
Right, but what was the backlash about?
Well, the contradiction is quite clear. While her democratic efforts are widely acknowledged, she does have a public record of previously advocating for, quote, forceful intervention to remove President Nicolas Maduro. So this raises some fundamental questions about the criteria for a peace award, especially when the recipient has, at times, supported methods involving violence or even external military action to achieve a political goal. It really highlights the blurred lines, doesn't it?
It does. Moving north to Europe, we saw significant political mobilization in Poland, led by the Conservative Law and Justice Party, PIS. They organized mass protests in Warsaw.
Correct. PIS, which is a major nationalist and Eurosceptic force, mobilized thousands, specifically against two major EU policies, the EU-Mercosur trade agreement and the EU Migration Pact. They framed this mass action as a necessary defense of Polish national sovereignty, arguing these agreements disproportionately threaten Polish agriculture and, well, national identity. It really reveals how deep that skepticism towards Brussels continues to shape domestic politics there.
Meanwhile, in France, the sort of systemic political deadlock seems to continue. President Emmanuel Macron had to quickly reappoint Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu just days after he resigned.
Yeah, that quick reversal signals intense political fragility. Lecornu's initial resignation came amid huge budget and political crises. The government was struggling to maintain parliamentary support for key laws. Forcing him back into the role so quickly highlights the severity of the governing difficulty and maybe the limited pool of viable alternatives for Macron. It certainly contributes to ongoing public frustration with the instability at the top.
And finally, in Norway, a country we often view as a model of stable democracy, we saw tension around freedom of expression and public order. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Oslo, near the parliament, coincided with a high-stakes World Cup qualifying match involving Israel.
Right, and the resulting confrontations were significant enough that they led to the detention of journalists, which always raises concerns. The event really underscores the difficulties modern European states face in balancing the right to peaceful protest, especially on emotionally charged international issues against the need to maintain public security and order during major public events.
This all raises a really important question. How are these incredibly diverse events, everything from elite military actions to European political disputes, how are they being framed, both by different traditional news sources and, maybe more crucially, by the global public on social media?
Well, the contrast in editorial slants is quite instructive. If you look at government-leaning framing, say Sputnik, Georgia, It focuses heavily on Georgian Dream's electoral success. It characterizes the opposition's actions purely as violent, destabilizing coup attempts. The narrative is all about defending order against radicalism.
Right. Conversely, more critical sources, like Spain's eldiario.es, approach the Machado Nobel Prize with careful nuance. They reported the honor, sure, but made sure to highlight that historical contradiction we talked about, awarding it to someone who previously supported forceful regime change. They prioritized context over just celebration.
Exactly. And in Poland, you see strong nationalist support for the protests. Outlets like niezależne.pl were highly favorable towards the PS mobilization, emphasizing their role as defenders of national sovereignty against what they see as aggressive overreach by EU policy directives.
But the truly global barometer, maybe, is found when you analyze social media sentiment. Looking at hashtags like #coup, #protest, #elections across platforms like X, we see a global pattern that should probably concern political leaders everywhere.
That pattern is defined by overwhelming negativity and polarization. User sentiments consistently average between 55 and 75% negative towards established governments, contested elections, or coups. And that holds true whether we're talking about events in South America, Africa, or Europe. There's just this deep, widespread distrust of power structures online.
And the reverse is equally clear, isn't it? Positive sentiment heavily favors protest movements. Online, these activists are framed as heroes fighting for democracy or engaging in a rightful stand against government overreach. The trend seems to be social media actively amplifying polarization, fostering a global undercurrent of dissatisfaction, often linked to calls for tangible action, sometimes even overthrowing perceived injustice.
Precisely.
So what does this concentrated analysis of fragility mean for the coming week? What specific indicators should you, our listeners, watch for as these situations continue to evolve?
I'd say you should monitor 3 immediate situations very closely. First, in Madagascar. The most critical step will be the official swearing in of Colonel Randrianarina, and crucially, the naming of the transitional cabinet. The composition of that cabinet will tell us immediately whether he intends to follow through on that 18 to 24-month election timeline, or if the transition might be extended.
Okay, and for Georgia?
For Georgia, we anticipate intensified political fallout. Watch for continued arrests related to the attempted coup investigation. More importantly, observe the degree of diplomatic pressure from the EU and the US. Any formal condemnation or threat of sanctions will signal serious international concern about the country's democratic path.
Right. And finally, Poland.
And in Poland, yes, monitor the short-term impact of that mass anti-EU protest led by PPE. The turnout and the messaging from that demonstration might well shape the current government's willingness to compromise on major EU policies moving forward, particularly those contentious trade and migration pacts.
So the common thread weaving through all of this seems to be this widespread public criticism of established power, amplified, as you said, exponentially through social media. It leaves us with a question. What does the increasing volume and intensity of this anti-government sentiment online mean for the feasibility of peaceful, stable governance? Especially in countries undergoing really delicate political transitions, something for you to mull over as the global political landscape continues to shift. This in-depth analysis was meticulously compiled using Stylo News, which synthesizes information from many traditional news sources and social media platforms, including X. To get AI-powered news on demand and stay ahead of the curve, you can subscribe to Stylo News at www.stylonews.com. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the week's critical events. We really appreciate you tuning in. Be sure to follow Stylo News on your favorite social media platforms.